Welcome and thank you everyone for joining us for another episode of the Jane Irrigation Training Series. I'm Richard Restuccia, Vice President of Water Management Solutions, and today we're going to be talking about turning your landscape images into prints. And a lot of people have said, gee, Rich, what does this have to do with irrigation now? And so I want to just say that we've had our guest, Michael Derewenko, on before, and he has done a fabulous job teaching us how to shoot video as well as prints of our jobs, whether it's a landscape job, if it's a ranch or a farm that we've developed over the years and we're proud of and we really want to show. He's helped us do that. They're some of our most popular webinars that we've done. And in talking to Michael about this, the next step, and I always go into the next step. Michael, I want to make my images that are on my computer into nice prints. A few years ago, when I was in the landscape business, contracting business, I used to take photos of my customers' landscapes and then give them to them as gifts, and they loved it. And so now Michael's taught us all how to shoot good images, and we want to know now how to print those images out, put them on our walls, display them nicely in our homes and our offices, or give them to guests. And Michael's been kind enough to come back and go through that with us. As you know, Michael's got an incredible background for this industry. Number one, he used to be a professional photographer. Number two, he's done a lot of marketing, video, and photography for Jane and other manufacturers. And number three, he's also a landscape contractor. He's worked in the contracting area, and now he's got a real focus on cannabis and hemp growing. So talk about a real full circle of experience that he brings to us today, and most importantly, shares with us and teaches us how to show the good work we've been doing in other forms of visual. So Michael, thanks and welcome, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so Michael, we were talking just a little bit before we started, got the recording going about like these images we're looking at. And it just seems like there's a lot of different tools you need really to create good images and good prints these days. Would you agree with that? Is it as complicated as I might think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like any, it's like any art. Knowing your audience, knowing what the final application is pretty key. I think the days when I started shooting, early '90s. When you start shooting photos, you're just shooting photos of anything, trying to learn the camera, learn the different aspects of the camera, and then you kind of evolve into shooting things that you're more interested in. And then that hopefully, if you stick it out, meshes into learning all the different resources and tools that exist. But ultimately, you're not really, when it becomes a profession, you're no longer really shooting for yourself as much. You're shooting for an audience, and ultimately, you're marketing your images for something in particular. And so that's when it definitely becomes more of a career and a profession than it does just kind of having fun shooting whatever you want to shoot. And so yeah, it becomes a little more meticulous. And any photographers and designers out there know that there's a big difference between shooting photos for yourself and then shooting photos where your final medium is going to go into a digital format, and you're going to manipulate the image to go into to marketing materials, which is kind of what we do. So when I shoot images like these ones in particular, I already have in my head when I'm shooting and working on them where they're going to end up. And that I think is the biggest disconnect between kind of professional photographers and more recreational photographers.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Start with the end in mind. Great suggestion there. Now, when we were both at Valley Crest, somebody said to me, well, why don't you guys just do really good work, which we did, but why don't you just really do the good work and then take photos of it and show that around instead of all the other things you're doing? And, particularly for our industry and the landscape industry, images are so valuable. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I've been using them for the last 25 years. Even as a small contractor, when I was younger, I was able to shoot photos of my landscapes, and you're just really able to maximize your efforts. Where through websites, through brochures, through any ending medium, you're able to stretch the impact of your designs, your installs, and your contracting efforts. Whereas, if you don't have images, it's very hard to do it with verbiage. I think also, I could say that the industry we work in is very visually oriented. So, we get a lot out of our visuals, and photography is the easiest way to showcase that.
Yeah, so I want to remind everybody that I have both the chat and the Q&A open. So if you have questions as we're going along, and I see I have my hand up right now. I hit a wrong button, but as we go along, please put them in the chat or the Q&A, and I'll relay those questions to Michael as we're going along. And Michael, what are we going to hear about today?
So as we spoke earlier, I don't want to cover too much, but I want to hopefully give everybody the nuts and bolts of what you need to know when, like we said, the final medium is very crucial. When you're shooting an image, knowing whether or not it's going to be on a website or something digitally, or it's going to make it to print and actually make it onto photo paper to be framed on your wall. These are some variables that you need to take into consideration. Kind of from start to beginning, when you're just setting up the settings on your camera, from anything from the size of the image to what type of image is coming out of your camera, or you're manipulating in software on your computer, into kind of standard and popular framing options. Very rarely do you see a triangle shaped image on somebody's wall. So we want to make sure that when you're framing something with a square, framing something with a rectangle, and you walk into a framing shop. Once again, as we discussed, framing can be quite expensive, and everybody wants a huge image like the one on my wall. But then when it comes time to frame it, it costs hundreds of dollars. And so these are things that need to be taken into consideration as you're pulling your camera out, maybe not as you've already shot a photo. And so I have them in order here, what we're going to cover.
Yeah, so keeping in mind what you said, keep the end in mind when I'm shooting. Now, I'm out in the field all the time taking pictures with my iPhone. Am I ever going to get an iPhone photo that I take to blow up into like 24 by 36?
So no, you're not. 24 by 36, no. So iPhones, I usually tell people 8 by 10 is pretty much the biggest you can go. Any more than that, you're going to start to see some gradient and some pixelation. You got to remember that you're putting an image. We've talked about this in the past. It goes back to the old, I use the metaphor, when you're recording a CD off of like a cassette tape, you're losing a generation of it. If you're recording off the radio onto a cassette, and then off the cassette onto a CD, you've lost 3 generations. So by the time you're hearing it, it's gonna be very fuzzy. And it's the same thing with an image, is the more times you try to duplicate it, the more you're gonna lose. And so the reason we want to try to shoot the largest possible image, and the reason the digital cameras these days shoot such large images, is because the person shooting has the idea that they're going to blow something up bigger and print it bigger. So you always err on the size of large, as opposed to the opposite, which an iPhone does. So on an iPhone, you're putting it onto a memory card, you're taking it off a memory card, you're putting it onto a computer, and then from a computer, it needs to go to the printer. So you're 2-3 generations away from the final product. So you're going to have some pixelation, which is fine. There's a compression aspect to it, which is in some of these definitions I have up on the screen here. But as you get larger, the compression stretches out, and that's where the pixelation happens. And you could probably go to an 11 by 14, which is the next size up from an 8 by 10. But if you get close enough, you're going to see it, and it better be really good natural light. Any kind of darkness you're going to see. And I mean, that's one of the huge, if you've seen, every time a new iPhone comes out, the first thing they advertise, or a new digital camera comes out, the first thing they advertise is shooting in the dark, because that's been a huge challenge for photographers for years. I mean, my camera goes up to, I think, 12,000th of a ISO, which is a very, very dark circumstance. You could shoot a candle in a dark room, but you have to pay a lot of money for that, and the camera has to be very still. And so it's always been a challenge. Same thing with like shooting bands in darkness with available light. So this has always been a challenge, and so as soon as you export the file, you better hope that it's a very crisp image, which is why when you see a good black and white image in a museum or on someone's wall, and it's got a very solid black and a solid white, that means somebody knew what they were doing, not only from the shooting, but from the printing aspect.
So, Michael, when you say a large camera or large format camera, I mean, we're talking about something that I have to load up on a hand truck, or what is a large camera?
Technically, I mean, if you've ever seen the old Ansel Adams black and white nature photos where he's got the curtain over his head, I mean, that's an 8x10 camera. So the negative that comes out of that camera is an 8x10. If you've seen an 8x10, photo, they're very large, 8 inches by 10 inches. A lot of architectural photography, some of the stuff I've done for architectural magazines were shot on a 4.5. So you have a 4.5-inch negative. This goes back to the generation aspect, where the larger the negative, the better and more crisp the print's going to be when you blow it up. If I take an image off an iPhone that's essentially the size of a stamp and blow it up to a 16x20, obviously it's going to be very difficult. But if my negative or my starting negative is an 8x10 and I'm going to a 16x20, you're going to get a very crisp image. And so one of the things that Ansel Adams, not just being at the right place at the right time, was you're getting one shot per negative, so there's no more clicking away. On his camera, you shoot one, you pull the slide out, you put another one in. You have no idea if you got the shot or not. He was shooting pretty much with manual light meters when he was doing that. And so that was one of the things that was really like kind of innovative for him. And when I was young, I used to think like anybody could go stand in Yellowstone at sunset and shoot a black and white photo, right? And then you realize that the detail involved with it is way more cumbersome of a process, and that his images were being blown up the size of 8 foot by 10 foot, where that's very difficult to do. That's a very steady camera, steady light, so it's a lot more complicated than it sounds or looks.
Right. So Ansel Adams was around a while back, right? His images are lasting forever. So I always want to think that technology has made this easier for us.
I mean, I think it has, ironically, like prints. I'm here in Florida now, and I went to get some of my what's called 120 or the 2.25 film that I shoot out of my Hasselblad that's over my right shoulder, left shoulder. And there's nowhere in Tampa that even will process the film. So what's happening now is, you could say, fortunately for the digital age, everybody is learning how to shoot photos maybe quicker. But the printing aspect, which is kind of why we're doing this today, is one of the kind of the lost arts. It's one thing to post something on social media or in a digital platform, but when it comes to the print is when your photography skills are truly tested. And so not only do you need to find the right resources for printing, but you have to make sure that you kind of have the idea that you're going to print something when you're shooting it, because you do need to make sure that it's lit better and that it's crispier than if you were going to put it on something more forgiving like a digital asset.
Yeah, so I love that, right? Because I love the convenience of having an iPhone, seeing the photos on there, sharing them with people, at dinner or whatever. And we spend a lot of time doing that, but we really don't get to see it. And what I do miss is seeing prints on the wall at my friends' houses when I go there. Or really, I don't have any, many prints at all of my family on my walls at home. So I'm really interested in learning how to do this.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to be. I 10 years ago I would have said something different, but I don't know that in our lifetime that they'll have a phone that actually is capable of shooting an image that can be blown up to the sizes that are more popular on the walls. It's just the phone is a phone with a camera attached to it. It's not a camera with a phone attached to it. And so it's the same thing with what we'll talk about here in a second with mirrorless cameras. Is a lot of cameras are very good at shooting video. They also shoot photos. A lot of cameras are very good at shooting photos. They also shoot video. There's yet to be in my opinion, a camera that does both consistently at the same quality. It's just not something that manufacturers are focusing on or can even focus on. The camera would be very large if you were going to do that, and very expensive. I just don't think the market exists for it yet. What I do, and to your comment about the iPhone and always having the convenience and shooting it, what I do like is, it draws people to photography. And if you're serious about it and you're pulling your camera out, I have a lot of people that love shooting photos on their iPhone, and I ask if they have a normal camera and they don't have a normal digital camera. And so if you're really serious about photography, you will quickly realize that there's challenges behind, blowing stuff up bigger, printing it. and you do ultimately have to have a separate camera to shoot stuff with. The iPhone will not, or your cell phone will not provide images that are likely to go on your walls. Maybe printed for a photo album, but not going to go on a wall.
Yeah. Okay.
So that being said, I wanted to open up with what I basically have a few slides, and these are some of the most popular questions I hear in relation to printing. And one of them is the format of the image itself. In marketing, we deal with these different images, and we're pretty familiar with them. Some are a little more dated, like a TIFF. You probably see a TIFF, which is it's a tag format image. And this is something that's a little older. When I used to scan my slides, because I would shoot slides instead of 35 millimeter negatives. Slides have a little bit more saturation, so the reds, the greens, and the blues came out a little bit better in some of the films. And so I would shoot slides. Well, when I would scan my slide and lose that generation before it would go into a computer, it was exported as a TIFF file. This was a very large scanned file. The problem with such a large file is it picks up every detail on the slide. So there's constantly dust, hair, every little thing because of the electrostatic behind it. So you spend a lot of time in post cleaning up images. So the TIFF is kind of, it's still used. A lot of, when I go back to our old, at every manufacturer I've been with, you go back to old 90s and early 2000s images, most of them were TIFFs. That was what cameras typically exported large files for. And then we would pull them into Photoshop, do work on them, and then export them either as a PSD if we were going to print, or export them as a JPEG if we were going to, post it on the website or something like that. A JPEG is basically a file that has already been manipulated. You're no longer going to be manipulating the file. It's a final product. The equivalent of that, or very close to that, is another file type that I don't have on here called a PNG. And a PNG is when we shoot products, as a manufacturer, we shoot products and they have the white background, or like a transparent background. So you could essentially put it over another image without having a white background. That's a PNG. And so a JPEG is a flat image that if I wanted to send it to somebody to use for print or for the website, I'm sending it under the impression that nobody is going to be manipulating that image any further. It's in its final state. Whereas a TIFF is something that's either coming out of the camera, coming out of a scanner, and going into like an intermediary program, and there's going to be some manipulation done. Same with the Photoshop. Photoshop, cameras don't spit out Photoshop. Adobe doesn't make a camera. So what comes out of a camera is typically a raw file. A raw file is essentially a TIFF file. It's a large file that you're exporting from a camera into software to be manipulated. And then in Photoshop, that's where we, like the first image I showed, there's layering involved. You're going to be doing touch-ups. If you're shooting, there's a human element, you're going to be cleaning up skin in Photoshop, and then you're going to be exporting it as a different file type, which is typically a JPEG or a PNG. And then
So
lastly, oh, sorry, go ahead.
When I save my photos on my iPhone again, I hate to keep going back to that. Well, and then I want to send them to somebody. It asks me what size do I want to send. And I'm assuming, but this is a question, I assume that they just want to question the biggest size, can we actually send that biggest size through the email? But is that right? Is that why they're asking?
They're probably asking because they're charging you for data. So if I had to guess, they're not. Remember that existed. The first iPhone was 06, I think, or 05. I always thought it was a lot longer, but iPhones have only been out for about 15 years. And so I think the original reason for that was because people were paying for the data. And so if you only got a gig a month and every photo you sent was 3 megs, they would add up quickly. And so I think the choice is that. I also think it's the speed of the website or the Wi-Fi or the internet you're on. I don't think anybody's choosing large under the impression they're going to text a 3 meg file and then print from that. Remember, once you send an image from your phone, which is essentially the camera, to somebody else's phone, you've lost a generation. So that's why now when you open up a photo or you drag a photo from iPhoto into a text, it says exporting at a lower quality. If you want to send a higher quality, you have to drag it to your desktop, let your desktop process it, and then send it through an email. And it's doing that because it's going to use, you don't know, but the background of your Apple software, it's processing that image it's compressing it, and then it's allowing it to be sent. And so when you're texting an image straight out of your phone, you're losing quality. And if you remember just recently, that we've kind of gotten over that, but if you send someone a video, it shows up as like a little stamp, and you're like, on their phone it's 1080, on your phone it's a stamp. And it's the same thing with photos. So I think the size is more based on that, more on Wi-Fi, internet speed, and are you willing to pay more money to, instead of 200 kilobytes, 3 megs? Like, what is the importance or priority of that image you're sending? Whereas when we're printing stuff, you need the largest file possible.
Right. Okay. Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. And then lastly, an EPS file. EPS is, we have all these great illustrations we use at Jane. A lot of our EPS are what we call like a vector style graphic. These are illustrations that we're going to go in and we're also going to manipulate. It's basically a large version of an illustration, just like a large version of a photo. So you may see EPS sometimes. Typically, when I see images in our old database of products from 15, 20 years ago that are saved as EPS, it's typically somebody that either didn't know what they were doing, or they were using just like defaulted, like basically the Microsoft Paint of images, whatever comes pre-installed on your computer. They're going to limit how many different file types you could export the image as. EPS was one of those. Typically, people are not exporting EPSs very often unless there's like graphic elements to it. So, but those are some of the more popular ones. Yeah. And your iPhone, one other thing is, so just like a WAV file basically is it's an audio visual file. So it's got an audio aspect to it, and it's also got a visual aspect to it. iPhones, they usually will export either like an MP4 or a WAV file of a video. They have their own version now, iPhones, of their file type. It's a proprietary thing. They do this intentionally, and they want you to keep using Apple products to try to move and manipulate those images. And so a lot of times now, when you upload photos to iPhoto and then you try to drag and drop them into something, not only does it drop the resolution, but you'll see it has a weird 3-letter code or acronym at the end. That's basically Apple's proprietary file type. They're trying to make sure that you don't pull something into an Adobe file or software and manipulate it. They want you to use Apple software to do that. So once again, this is where you start to run into challenges with iPhone photos. They're great for websites, social media posts, for emailing around. But when it comes to print, putting into marketing materials, it's not something you're going to do.
Okay, so then when I pull it out of my Nikon,
yeah,
I'm going to be able to does it automatically get saved in a format, or do I save it in a format?
So I shoot Nikon, same thing with Canon. So you can choose the file type you want it exported as. So that's what you're going to do. So you're going to choose whether or not you want it exported as a JPEG, which would be something, I mean, if you're exporting a file out of your camera as JPEG, then you really have no intention of manipulating the image. It's something, maybe you're shooting family photos, clicking them away. It's going to go into your computer. It's going to get emailed off. You're never going to pull it into, software where you're going to be doing any kind of changes to it. When I shoot big stuff, and what most professionals shoot is we do a combination. So now cameras allow you to do 2 different file types. And so what I export is a JPEG for previewing. That way, if I'm in the field and we're in an orchard or something and we're shooting photos, I'm not waiting on my camera to process what's called a RAW file, RAW, which is a very, very large file, hundreds of megabytes. And so if you were constantly previewing RAW images on your camera, you just see kind of a little buffering thing on your camera, not to mention you're just kind of cooking your battery. There's no reason to do that. And so what you do is you choose what's called, it's an option that says JPEG plus RAW. So that way, every time I shoot a photo, it's simultaneously recording a RAW image to the SD card or the memory card, and then it's also producing a JPEG image, which is low res, for previewing. And that's where you're able to flick through. So if you ever flick through a digital camera and there's like a delay, it's because you're probably you're over processing your images. You don't need to shoot just raw images. Not only is it going to kill your battery, it's going to overwork you're going to go through memory cards faster. And so now most digital cameras or large SLRs are going to allow you to process 2 images at once. So when you shoot it low res and high res at the same time, one's for previewing, one's for exporting for either manipulation or for printing.
Right. Great. So it's really the best of both worlds when you do it that way.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, and you got to kind of know how to do that, but most cameras will allow you to choose the file type that you want to export it as. Nikon has their, I think it's NDS. They have some proprietary files that they allow you to export. So does Canon. Ideally, all these companies are trying to get you to use their software as much as possible, and then Adobe's just battling it out with them. And there's a reason that they're kind of the leader in all of this, is because they allow you to import and export different file types, where Nikon software is a little more difficult to do that with.
Right.
And,
Interesting. Okay. That's really
yeah,
helpful.
and then the different file types is one thing, and then obviously the size of the image. So if I'm, when we're shooting in the field and we've got our production team shooting videos, and I'm just firing stuff off of growers getting interviewed or shooting irrigation products in the field, and I know that they're never going to make it on a billboard, or we're never going to blow them up to trade show size. I don't need to overwork my camera. The last thing I want to do is spend 20 minutes downloading 20 photos at the end of the night in a hotel room when I don't need to. I don't need these large files. And so if I know that it's only going to be put into a digital resource, I'm going to shoot it smaller. I'm not going to shoot it large. I don't want to overwork the camera, fill up my memory card if I'm on a longer trip. And so I'm going to shoot it smaller. So along with the file type, I'm able to choose the file size. And so, like I've posted here, these are kind of, I don't know if there's a true definition. I'm sure there's a textbook somewhere that mentions the definition. When I think of small, medium, and large files, this is kind of what I have in mind. I always use the rule of thumb. If you're using Outlook or Gmail or something, there's a reason Gmail limits 20 meg files, and our Outlook, limits 10 to 15 meg files. You really don't need anything bigger than that. That large image behind me, I think, is like a 20 by 36 or something, which is basically poster size. Maybe 24 by 36 is poster size. That image could probably be 15 megs, and you could look at it with a magnifying glass with no pixelation. So, and that was scanned from a slide about 10 years ago. So you don't really need anything bigger than that. If you're shooting something for a trade show, or like the billboards you see, or when you're in Hollywood and you see the sides of buildings that are giant images, those are 500-600 meg files. Those are large files. They're coming out of a very, very large camera. Or now I love these days when it's like shot on iPhone at the big Lightning Arena here. It's like shot on iPhone, and it's like I might be shot on an iPhone. I don't know if it was printed from an iPhone. There was definitely something happening there, because I'm unable to get a photo to print from my iPhone the size of a billboard. So I'm interested if anyone out there knows how that's done. But that's kind of a big joke with professionals when we see that. We're just like, I don't know if that was shot with an iPhone. But I think what they're doing is they're using their iPhone as a previewer, and they're using a bigger camera, because you can connect an iPhone to a big digital camera. I think there's probably something going on there. But this is what I think of when I think of image sizes. And so small and medium, these are going to be for your digital resources. Anything over 8-10 megs, this is going to be something that you could print from. But like I said, rule of thumb is if you're printing 24 by 36, like a poster size image, you need something that's 15 megs or larger, maybe even 20 megs or larger, depending on how dark it is. A dark image like that, you're going to need it to be bigger, because the compression we talked about, if it's nice natural daylight, printers, they really like natural bright light. You wouldn't need it to be as large, because the pixelation gets lost in the whiteness. Pixelation does not get lost in the blackness.
And we have a question coming in from one of the viewers, and they're asking, so this small, medium, or large, the image size, that's a setting on my Nikon or my Canon camera?
Yeah, there's two different elements to the size. One is going to be exporting it from your camera, putting it onto your computer. Once it goes onto your computer, it's going to get a little bit bigger, because as soon as it goes onto your computer, like I said, your computer is ultimately got background processes going on, where it's taking it, it's basically digitizing it, it's making it, it's got to spit it out through a screen. And so there's things going on. So the file gets a little bit bigger. So it might be 5 or 6 megs coming out of your camera. By the time you export it into your software, it's probably going to be about 7 or 8 megs. It gets a little bit bigger. And then ultimately exporting it, you're going to choose the size of the export. And so when you export it, depending on the file type, it's going to kind of work in tandem with the file size. Your iPhone allows you to choose which size you want to export it as. When I export files from my computer, like out of Photoshop and whatnot, I can limit the size, not to exceed on the low side or the high side. But usually I've got everything cranked to 11. Like I want everything as big as possible when I export it, because I want to pull as much detail out of the images as possible. And so, yeah, so there's two different aspects: the exporting from the camera and then the exporting from your computer into your final medium, or however it's going to be displayed.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you.
And that, that leads us to the different camera types. As you mentioned, iPhone's very popular. Each iPhone that comes out gets better. iPhone, you are limited to lenses. Now iPhones have multiple lenses. One's a fisheye, one's a zoom lens, and then one's that new portrait lens, which is ultimately just a tighter aperture or focal plane. I saw that on the football game the other night too. I see they're doing that now, is they use that kind of tight focus where the back's blurred out, then the subject matter is crisper. I was asking Speed, actually, the guy that helps with production, he thinks that they're shooting wide frame and then displaying it as, or they're shooting full frame and displaying it as not full frame. And so it kind of has that effect. I also think that it's just kind of, it's an artsy way of dropping out the background and making you focus on the subject matter in the front, which is kind of like we talked about. The two main things with photography are knowing your final medium. Are you going to print? Is it going to a digital resource? Or and then who's in your image? What story are you trying to tell? We're trying to ultimately draw people's attention and tell a story with every image we shoot. And so, if you've got me in the middle and taking up your whole frame and there's a castle in the background, it's not much of a story. And so, you always want to kind of draw people's attention away from other aspects and other parts of the image. And so these are things to think about when you're framing your different subjects. And so that being said, it doesn't matter what kind of camera you have. What you're shooting and how you're framing things is reliant on you and your imagination. How you're capturing that image and what your final purpose for that image is going to be where you're going to make your camera decisions. And so these are some cameras that that we use. We use a little bigger Nikon, the bottom one in the corner, SLR, as we've talked about in the past. That's a single lens reflex, which means we're bouncing the image off of a mirror onto a sensor. So we're losing one generation. However, they shoot quicker, they shoot faster, they shoot larger, they're more durable. So a camera like that's great for traveling. The point and shoot in the top right is also good for shooting. Me and most professionals have all of these cameras in our bag at once for different things. So part of it is what are we going to shoot? Where is it going to go? And then we pull out the different paintbrush to paint that picture. And these are some popular ones. The one on the right is a Hasselblad. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. What's the one that kind of looks like my dad might have been using?
So that's a camera I use. That's the big one back there. That's a Hasselblad. So my camera was built in 1954. You can look the serial numbers up online. They're very expensive because they're old, but if it's not broke, don't fix it. And a camera like that, very similar. And ironically, the camera on the left, the Sony, which is a very popular one that we film a lot of our videos, a lot of Hollywood movies have been filmed on this, low budget Hollywood movies. If you look inside that lens where the bayonet of the lens would be, you see there's no mirror there. It's just blackness. Well, the reason for that is that means the image is going directly through the lens onto the sensor. So we're not losing a generation at all. So it's going to be very crisp, and that's the same thing as the Hasselblad. So it's essentially the same technology, just like the bottom one where we're losing, we got the image bouncing off a mirror. That way you can look through a viewfinder. The one on the right, you have to look down on it because ultimately the only reason there's a mirror involved is to make sure your image isn't flipped over. And so the same technology goes into both the digital version and the medium format, as we call it. So there's a 2¼ inch negative on the far right one. That's what I shoot when I am shooting people, because it makes skin look really clear and crisp. I'm shooting black and white. And then ultimately I have the idea that I'm going to blow it up very large. The only difference between those two is the one on the left, as you can see, shoots a rectangle because it's got a rectangular hole. And the one on the right shoots a square because it's got a square hole. And so this is something you take into account when you're framing and printing these images. Obviously, very rarely do you put a rectangular image in a square frame or the opposite. So, you want to remember that when you're shooting it. Like I said, all these things are in my camera bag. Not all dependent. A lot of times I'll use my point and shoot just to meter the lighting. I'll get my readings out of that, and then I'll pull out my Hasselblad and set everything up on the lens because I don't really use the light meter on that. It's 75 years old. So, but so they all have all these tools have their own purpose. Never do I travel with just a single camera. That would drive me crazy. So,
what a smart way to do it. I like that tip very much. Thanks.
Yeah. All right, so I can just do this. All right. And so ultimately, once we've got our files from the camera onto our computer, now we need to get them to the printer. How do we get them to the printer? Now you can go to the local drugstore and print, but you can print off of a CD. This goes back to the generation thing. So if you're printing off a CD, now we've got a file that's bounced off of a mirror, made it onto a sensor. It's being pulled from the sensor of the camera onto the computer. So it's been processed 3 or 4 times. Now you're going to burn it onto a CD. You're going to lose another generation. Anything bigger than 8x10, you're going to get some pixelation unless it's a very crisp outdoor image. So we're going to speak in worst case scenario where it's a darker image. I would try to stay away from CDs. I mean, our trucks don't even have CD players in them anymore. So I think CDs are going by the wayside. A USB has a great compression to it. So you're able to store stuff on a USB, pull it off a USB with very little resolve. You're not going to lose a lot of detail to your image coming off of a USB, and most computers come with the USB plug. So typically I'll use a USB if I'm moving a few photos. Same thing with an external hard drive, essentially the same thing. You're just larger images, more images. It's a little more cumbersome for the file management aspect. If you bring that into a printer and it's got 6,000 photos on it, you're trying to give them a file name and a type, they're going to get a little frustrated with you. So if you've only got 3 or 4 images, I think the best route is to just get a simple little USB with a gig or 2 available on it and bring it into your local printer and allow them to print from it. The camera itself, actually, it puts the image onto an SD card, which is in the bottom right. There's different size SD cards. That's a smaller one. My camera actually uses a small SD card for the JPEG version of the file, and then a larger, I actually have one right here. A larger card like this. It's like this is 4 gigs. So it uses a larger card, and this is what my larger images are going to be on. And so it's got a combination of the SD card next to this. This very rarely leaves my camera because there's a series of brass pins in the camera, and when you pull it out and put it in, you can potentially bend those pins. So I typically plug in a USB or an HDMI cord into my camera to pull the images off. I've had that happen a couple of times, and they're really expensive to replace. And so I try to stay away from pulling a big memory card in and out. Once again, that's my opinion. I know other people out there, I've had photographers tell me that it's not as crisp. If I was doing something like when we do our trade shows, I pull the memory card out, put it into a reader, put the reader into the computer. I do think that you probably lose a little bit, but only if you're blowing it up really large and it's a dark image, are you going to see it? This is very, at a professional level. I think most people are leaving their memory cards in there, and SD card's a popular one.
All right. So would it be best for me just to take my SD card out of my camera and take that to my print shop?
Yeah, you could do that. Or I think the best one, I saved it for last, is an FTP website. So typically printers, like I still get my stuff printed in California, even though I'm in Florida, because I have a really good resource out there. I think they do great work. Once you work with a printer for a certain amount of time, there's a lot of like little details, once again, at a professional level, that you just don't want to have to orchestrate every single time you need something printed. And so they present like an FTP website, and that means it's a file transfer website. And so what you're doing is your memory card will go into a reader. I don't have one available, but it's a memory card reader. It's got a bunch of different slots for different size memory cards. It's got a USB on the other side. You'll upload the image to your computer, and then you'll go online and you'll upload the image to the file transfer website. And each printer, most modern day printers, I think even I know like Kinko's or the local drugstore, they all have websites, FTP websites. You can go on, upload your image, and then they're just going to pull the image off their database and print from that. That way you don't even have to mess with hardware at all. Everything is done digitally. And so you can do that very large. FTP sites will take multiple gig size files. And so, for instance, when we did the prints for like our offices, our corporate offices, we want really big images. I'm not sending negatives. I'm not sending memory cards. I'm uploading a bunch of photos to an FTP website named exactly how I want them, with the print size in the name and description. And they're printing from that, and then they're shipping direct. So I think gone are the days of having to drive anywhere to get your prints done. And like you said, there's apps and stuff to frame your photos on your iPhone and through websites. it's all done digitally. I mean, it's kind of archaic to actually have to bring in a CD or anything like that, although I know that that medium still exists.
Yeah, that's interesting. Now, do you remember the Photoshop booths in the parking lot of the grocery store, or was that pre your day?
Oh no, I mean, one of my first jobs was working at Walgreens printing photos. So I mean, I remember changing out all the chemicals, and then obviously I spent years printing images in school. I would love to, it's really hard to find the chemicals now. A lot of the chemicals, apparently mercury is an issue for people. So a lot of the issues, a lot of the chemicals now are a little harder to find, and they're really expensive. I would love to have a dark room. I mean, I've spent 8 to 12 hours printing one image, and so the art of printing is an art in itself. And any photographer will tell you that I'm never happy with prints I get. Any print I have on my walls that someone else printed, I'm never happy with it. There's a local community college here that I just stopped in the other day to see if I could somehow find, like, use their print room, because they still have a print room to print from, because it's addictive. There's nothing better than getting a solid black and white print, out of a print shop. And very rarely do, now everything's digital printers. I mean, they're 20, 30, $50,000 to print a good image. That's why we pay other people to do it. But I can tell the difference between a digital printed black and white and a printed one. So there is an art to it. But I think, for all intents and purposes, like we're talking about for contractors, for landscape architects, people trying to display their work in their home or office, I think the digital aspect of it is more than fine.
Right. Okay.
And kind of lastly, once you've taken your image from your camera, put it into your software, now it comes time to print. Well, the printer is going to ask you what size you want it printed. As we started at the top of the hour, printing is expensive. Framing is expensive. Framing is more expensive than printing, because things are printed digitally, and with the technology behind laser printers now, they use very minimal ink, so there's not nearly as much ink that we used to use. So you can get a nice print done for maybe $30, $40, very, very large. The problem is the matting and the framing. The matting and the framing is labor intensive. The glass that is put into frames is usually custom done. Glass is very expensive as well. And then not to mention whatever's going around the frame, whether or not it be wood, aluminum, larger frames. Like I mentioned, this one back here was custom made. There's a huge holdout from me getting a lot of my photos printed because of the expense behind framing. The other day, I took a photo in that was 20 by 24, and they wanted $560 to print it. And that was just with a very basic frame. And so, we also talked before we started, I think, recording, when you go to a museum and you see these nice gold leaf frames, there's a reason that they kind of look 3D. They're not just made like that to look cool and to look more presentable. A lot of the reason they have that gold on there is reflective light. There wasn't a lot of glass around a long time ago on the tops of paintings and photos. And so the main thing this does is it really reflects light and drags light across the front surface of the artwork. And so very rarely will you see photos framed with like a 3D style gold frame. Most photo frames are going to be flat because of that, because you're going to get glare across them, and especially if there's glass involved. Typically it's paintings or something that's matte finished is going to have kind of the gold leaf, grandeur, European style frame. So when it comes to framing photos, you want a very shallow frame, as one, not to pull your attention away from the photo itself, and two, you don't want the light manipulated across or raking across the front of the image, creating a glare. There's nothing worse, like you can see behind me, than having a glare on the glass. And so ideally, you either, one, don't have glass, which I know sounds crazy because the image isn't protected, but like I said, images are not that expensive to print. So when I go to print my very large black and white images, there will not be glass in front of them, because I want people to see the image as what it is. I don't want it to be distorted by the glass in front of it. So the purists in us prefer to use old school negatives, old school printing with no glass. So it is all very old school. But once you see that in an art gallery, you'll realize what I'm talking about. There's a crispness to it that just doesn't exist hidden behind glass. Typically, we have glass for protective, not for to magnify or to make the image itself look any better. And these are some popular frame sizes I put up here. They're pretty self-explanatory. Any bigger than 20 by 24 of an image, you're You're probably not going to be framing it. Not to mention, you got to remember when glass gets to a certain size, it's very hard to keep it flat against an image. You get waves that exist, and then all of a sudden you get distortion, and the image isn't going to be as crisp. So typically images aren't bigger than 20 by 24 unless they're getting like on stretch cloth for like trade shows, billboards, a canvas of some sort. We're not going to put glass any bigger than 20 by 24. Not only is it expensive, but it could break, and it's kind of sketchy having glass that big.
And it's interesting, right? The technology brings convenience. We know this in music. We know this in photos. But if you really want the best quality, right, you go back to a reel-to-reel for music, or negative and printing for a photo.
I mean, Quentin Tarantino shoots everything on film. We talk about this all the time. I mean, a lot of people, Nolan shoots everything on film. So there's a reason people shoot stuff on film. And there's just a quality to it. And you can have the biggest, nicest new TV, but looking at film, it's just, like I said, anytime there's a human element to it, this is my main reason to shoot film, is it just makes skin, and it makes humans look better. It pulls the skin tones out better. It pulls, there's a natural look to it. Whereas digital can be overly crisp, which is why like sporting events are shot, because you also have a rate of speed when you're shooting action, with a camera. You need to capture things very quickly. But when you're shooting people up close or in very dark situations, I think film is always the best way to go. But like I said, I carry every camera in my tote, and there's a time and a place for everything. And then lastly, I know we're running out of time, but lastly, this is just a simple wall of a collage of images. And matting is not something we really got into. Matte is something that you're going to work with your framer on. I think typical rule of thumb is when you're putting pictures on your wall or frames on your wall, you don't want the space in between them to be any closer than the matting that is around the image. As you can see, there's some consistency here, which doesn't deter from keeping your eye on images. And so you got to remember, ultimately, you're not trying to present the frame, you're trying to present the photo. And so if the frame and the way that you display them on the wall is taking away from the central focus, which is the image, then you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing.
Yeah, what an amazing, beautiful wall. Did you take all those photos?
No, I didn't take any of those.
Okay. All right. Well, it looks great. I love that. I love that style too. So Michael, this has been an amazing webinar. I've learned so much. I mean, you really got into some good detail. I think I better understand now how to get a good print out of what I have in my camera and what I have in my iPhone, and more importantly, what sizes I can actually get to, and that's going to be really helpful. But if we have some additional questions or comments, we can ask you.
Yeah. Shoot me an email. I mean, or go through Twitter. I post photos on Twitter as much as I can, just so people have some idea of, kind of what we're looking at, what still intrigues us and myself. If the Jane's USA Instagram account is full of great imagery that, we have some photographers on our team that we've posted. I always try to plug it because I do think it's a great timeless database. We try not to overly promote, not only products, but just, random industry things through our Instagram. It is kind of an eternal database where it's just got great imagery that can always be used. If there's ever anything on there that somebody maybe needs for a presentation, or to further their efforts in the industry, they can always reach out and ask us, and we'll provide it carte blanche. There's a reason that we have all these images, and we'd love to share them, just like Shutterstock shares their images. We're more than willing to give up our images where needed. Yeah,
it's really a generous offer, Michael. Thank you. I think it's important to remind everybody that you were a paid professional photographer before you got into this in water management. So
that's right.
Real unique talent that you have that you're willing to share is very nice. So anyway, thank you, Michael. Great job today. Thank you to all of you who have joined us today. We really appreciate it. Remember, you can see all our trainings at janesusa.com/trainings, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. We'll be back on Friday. David Lindsay is going to talk to us about the coming 3G sunset and how to upgrade your Jane Logic equipment to 4G, and some of the pricing specials they have available right now. So should be really interesting. Thanks again, Michael. Thanks to everybody. And we'll see you on Friday.